The morning Owen Callard walked into his own boardroom and found a child sitting in the chair meant for his next appointment. He did not say a word for almost 10 seconds. He stood in the doorway with his coffee going cold in his hand, and he looked at the girl. She couldn't have been more than 11, maybe 12 at a stretch, sitting very straight in the leather chair that cost more than some people's monthly rent, her backpack on her lap, her hands folded on top of it like she was waiting for a school bus. She had dark brown braids, one coming loose on the left side, and she was wearing a coat that was a size too big, the cuffs folded back twice so her hands could reach out of them. She looked back at him without flinching. "Are you Mr. Callard?" she asked. He stepped into the room and let the door close behind him. "I am, and you are?" "Wren," she said. "Wren Hadley. My mom was supposed to be here." Owen set his coffee on the long mahogany table and pulled out the chair 2 seats away from her, not the one at the head. He sat down. Something in the way she'd said supposed to be told him not to stand over her. "Your mother had an interview this morning." "Yes." Wren reached into her backpack and pulled out a manila envelope, slightly creased at the corner, and placed it on the table between them. "Her portfolio. She finished it last night. She wanted you to still see it." Owen did not open the envelope yet. He looked at the girl. "Where is she?" Wren's jaw tightened just slightly, the way children do when they've decided not to cry and are holding to that decision with everything they have. "She's at St. Michael's, the hospital. She went in last night. Her heart." She paused. "She made me promise to bring the portfolio anyway. She said she'd worked too hard on it to just let the appointment go." Outside the windows on the 42nd floor, Toronto glittered cold and gray under a February sky. Owen had 5 other candidates whose files were sitting in a folder on his desk. A senior graphic design position, 12 applicants narrowed to 5, and his assistant Martha had scheduled the interviews at 45-minute intervals, starting at 8:30. It was now 8:42. The woman who should have been sitting in this chair, a Margaret Hadley, according to the file, was in a cardiac ward 3 kilometers away, and her daughter had come in her place. "How did you get here?" Owen asked. "TTC," Wren said. 2 words. No elaboration, as if taking the subway alone to a downtown skyscraper at 8 in the morning was completely ordinary. "Does anyone know you're here?" "My neighbor, Mrs. Osei. She knows. She said she'd call the school." Wren tilted her chin toward the envelope. "Are you going to look at it?" Owen reached across the table and opened the envelope. He had hired designers for 20 years. He'd seen portfolios from OCAD graduates with perfect kerning, and portfolios from self-taught freelancers working off kitchen tables, and he thought he had a reasonable sense, within about 90 seconds, of whether someone had the instinct for the work or was simply technically competent at it. He turned the pages slowly. Margaret Hadley had the instinct. The work was clean without being cold. There was a campaign for a small food bank in Scarborough, done pro bono, a small note said at the bottom, that used color in a way Owen hadn't seen in a long time. Warm ochres and deep greens that somehow made scarcity look dignified rather than pitiful. There was a rebrand for a physiotherapy clinic in Hamilton, a series of illustrated children's book covers, and at the back, 3 speculative pieces, clearly done without a client, just because she'd wanted to. Concepts for a community garden signage system, a wayfinding project for a neighborhood with a large deaf population that incorporated tactile elements into the visual design. Owen paused on that last one for a long time. "She's been doing design for a while," he said, without looking up. "Since before I was born," Wren said. "She used to work at an agency downtown. She left when I was little." She said it plainly, without resentment. "Why did she leave?" Wren looked at him with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite suspicion, more like she was measuring how much she wanted to explain to a stranger in a suit. Then she said simply, "Me. She didn't want me in daycare 12 hours a day. So she went freelance, so she could do school drop-off and pick-up." Owen closed the portfolio and rested his hand flat on the cover. He thought about his own daughter, who was 9 and who he had, if he was honest with himself, seen approximately 43 mornings in the past year because his car picked him up at 7:15 and she rarely woke before 7:30. He pushed that thought to the side. "Wren," he said, "would you like some hot chocolate? We have a kitchen down the hall." She considered this for a moment as if checking it for traps. "Okay," she said. "Yes, thank you." He had Martha get the hot chocolate, and while Wren sat in the small kitchen area with her hands around the mug, Owen made a call. He found out that Margaret Hadley had been admitted to St. Michael's at 11:47 the night before. Atrial fibrillation, with some additional complications. They were still running tests to clarify. She was in the cardiac unit. She was stable. She was alone. He stood at his office window looking down at King Street, and he tried to reconstruct the sequence of events. A woman who'd spent years building a freelance career around her daughter's schedule, who'd taken the time to apply for this position, to put together that portfolio, to get the interview, and then at midnight she'd been rushed to emergency, and the first thing she'd apparently done was call her 12-year-old daughter and ask her to take the portfolio to the interview in the morning. He didn't know whether to find that heartbreaking or remarkable. He decided it was probably both. He went back to the kitchen. Wren was still there. She had finished the hot chocolate and was now drawing something in a small notebook with a mechanical pencil, the kind that clicks. She didn't stop when he walked in. "Can I ask you something?" Owen said, sitting down across from her. "You're the boss," she said, which was not quite yes and not quite no. "Your mom, does she know you came here by yourself?" Wren kept drawing. "I texted her from the subway. She told me not to." She paused, clicked the pencil, "but she also told me to bring the portfolio. So those two things conflict a little, I know." She looked up then, and her eyes were very direct, very steady. "But she worked on that portfolio for 2 weeks. She stayed up until 1 in the morning 3 nights in a row. I could hear her. She tapped the pencil against the notebook once. Someone should see it." Owen was quiet for a moment. "Someone did," he said. He rearranged his morning. He wasn't sure why exactly, or he was sure but didn't examine it too closely. He told Martha to push his 9:15 and call to reschedule the remaining interviews for the following week. He told her he'd explain later. Then he went and told Wren that he would drive her to St. Michael's himself. Wren looked at him with that measuring expression again. "Why?" "Because you're 12 years old and you came downtown alone on the subway and your mother is in the hospital. That's why." She thought about this for a moment. Then she put the notebook back in her backpack and stood up. "Okay," she said, "but I'm telling them at the desk that you're my uncle, otherwise they might not let you in." Owen blinked. Do you do this often?" "First time," she said, "but it seems like the kind of thing that would work." In the car, with the city moving past the windows and the heat turned up against the February cold, Wren sat with her backpack on her lap again and looked out at the street. She wasn't the kind of child who filled silence with chatter. Owen found he appreciated that. "Your drawings," he said after a while. "In the notebook, what were you drawing?" "Lettering," she said. "I'm working on a hand-lettered alphabet. I want the capital Q to feel less awkward. It always looks awkward." Owen glanced over. "Capital Q is awkward. Every font struggles with it," she said matter-of-factly. "It's the tail. It either looks like a mistake or it looks like it's trying too hard." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother taught you about design." It wasn't quite a question. Wren considered it anyway. "She doesn't teach me on purpose," she said. "I just live with her. You absorb stuff." At the hospital, Wren did not, in the end, need to introduce Owen as her uncle. Margaret Hadley was awake when they arrived. She'd been moved to a quieter room an hour earlier, and when Wren pushed open the door and her mother saw her standing there, the expression on Margaret's face was the kind that doesn't have a clean name in English. Relief and exhaustion and love, and something that looked a lot like guilt all at once. "Wren," her voice was rough, "I told you not to come alone." "I didn't," Wren said. "I brought someone." Owen stepped into the doorway, and Margaret Hadley looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen directed at him in a long time, the look of someone who has no idea what to expect and is too tired to pretend otherwise. "Mr. Callard," she said. "Mrs. Hadley." He held up the manila envelope. "I looked at your portfolio." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, they were bright. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about this morning. I know the position. I know this isn't how. The community garden wayfinding project," he said, "with the tactile elements. Walk me through it." She stared at him. "Unless you're too tired," he said. "It can wait." "I'm not too tired," she said, and she pushed herself up slightly against the pillow, and something shifted in her face, the particular shift that happens when a person gets to talk about the work they love and means it. "I came across a study out of UBC about wayfinding in mixed-ability public spaces. The idea was that if you design for the edges, for the people with the most navigation challenges, you actually create better wayfinding for everyone. Wren sat down in the chair by the window and took out her notebook. She started working on the capital Q again. Owen sat in the other chair and listened. He stayed for an hour and a half. He couldn't have explained it to his board, or to his assistant, or to most people he knew professionally. He had 3 meetings that afternoon that Martha was currently rearranging with the patience of a saint. He was sitting in a hospital room in February, listening to a freelance designer talk about tactile signage systems and universal design principles, and he was taking notes in the margins of the file he'd brought in from the car. At some point, a nurse came in to check Margaret's monitors and gave Owen a look that was professionally neutral, but probably meant visiting hours are technically not for 2 hours. Owen smiled at her. She said nothing and left. "You don't have to stay," Margaret said after a while. "I'm aware," Owen said. She looked at him. She was a careful person. He could see it in the way she spoke, the way she measured her words, the way she'd looked at him when he first walked in, assessing before trusting. He suspected she hadn't had a lot of reasons to trust easily. "Why are you here?" He thought about that for a moment. The honest answer was complicated, and he wasn't sure he fully understood it himself. He said, "Because your daughter rode the subway alone to bring me your portfolio at 8 in the morning, and because she was right that someone should see it." Margaret looked over at Wren, who was still drawing, absorbed entirely in the Q. "She's going to be better than me," Margaret said quietly. "She's already better than me in some ways, and she doesn't know it yet." "She knows the Q is awkward," Owen said. Margaret laughed, a short, surprised sound, and then winced a little and pressed her hand to her chest. "Don't make me laugh, it pulls." "Sorry." She shook her head, still smiling, and looked back at him. "What happens now, with the position?" He was quiet for a moment. There were 4 other candidates. Competent people, experienced people, with portfolios that were perfectly good, and interviews that would go exactly as expected. He had a process for this. He had always had a process. "The remaining interviews are next week," he said. "I'll let you know the decision by the end of the month." He paused. "You should know that your portfolio is the strongest I've seen." She looked at him steadily. "But, no but," he said. "That's the complete sentence." He drove back to the office through the gray Toronto afternoon and sat in his car in the parking structure for a moment before going up. He wasn't a sentimental man. He'd built Callard Creative from a 2-person studio in a rented room on Queen West to a 40-person firm with offices in Toronto and Calgary, and he'd done that by being clear-eyed and practical and occasionally ruthless in the ways that business sometimes requires. He knew what he was. He was not the kind of person who spent mornings in hospital rooms for no reason. He thought about Wren's hands folded on her backpack in the boardroom chair, the portfolio pages, the capital Q, the community garden signage and the tactile wayfinding, and 2 weeks of late nights he'd heard described through a child's memory of lying in bed listening to her mother work. He thought about his own daughter. He called his driver and told him not to bother tonight. He'd pick up Sadie from school himself. 3 weeks later, he called Margaret Hadley. She had been discharged after 5 days, was on a new medication regimen, had gone back to freelance work from home while she monitored her energy levels. Her voice on the phone was stronger than it had been in the hospital room, cleaner. "I'm offering you the position," Owen said. "Permanent, 3 days in office and 2 remote, full benefits including health, start date flexible to give you time to get your strength back." There was silence on the line. "Mr. Callard," she said carefully, "the other candidates were good," he said. "You were better, and I'm not in the habit of hiring for sentiment. I'm in the habit of hiring for work." Another silence, longer this time. "Okay," she said. Her voice was quiet. "Okay, yes." He waited a moment. Then, "How's Wren?" He heard something shift in Margaret's voice when she answered. Warmth, and something underneath it that might have been relief, the kind that comes not from a single good thing happening, but from a long period of worry being at last slightly loosened. "She finished the alphabet," Margaret said. "The whole thing, capital and lowercase. She made the Q work. I have no idea how she did it. She probably figured out the tail," Owen said. "She did." A pause. "She wants to show it to you, actually. She asked me. I told her I didn't know if that was appropriate, and she said, and I'm quoting, 'He sat in the hospital for an hour and a half. I think he'd want to see the Q. Owen looked out his window at the February skyline, which had, in the past 3 weeks, given way to something tentatively closer to March, the grey softening just slightly at the edges. "She's not wrong," he said. On Margaret's first day, a Tuesday in late March, Wren came with her. It hadn't been planned, or rather, it had been negotiated the way things with Wren were apparently always negotiated, which was that Wren had a PA day, and there was a logic to the situation that she presented plainly and without particular drama, and Margaret had looked at Owen and he had said it was fine. Wren sat at the small work table in Owen's office that was usually covered in physical mock-ups and printed comps, and she spread out her notebook, and she worked on lettering while the adults worked on other things. At 11 o'clock she asked Owen's assistant Martha if there was any more of that hot chocolate. "There is," Martha said, in the tone of someone who has decided something about a person and doesn't intend to revisit it. "Do you want marshmallows?" Wren looked genuinely surprised. "You have marshmallows? I keep them in my desk," Martha said. "Don't tell anyone." At lunch, Owen walked with Margaret and Wren the 4 blocks to a ramen place on Richmond that he'd been going to for 8 years. They sat at the counter. Wren ordered the tonkotsu and ate it with complete seriousness, like it was important work. "She's eaten ramen since she was 4, Margaret said, in the tone of someone who has told this story before and still finds it funny. "She rejected a grilled cheese I made and asked for proper noodles. I didn't know what to do." "I have good taste," Wren said without looking up from her bowl. "You're 12, Margaret said, "and I have good taste," she said, which apparently settled it. Owen laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes out before you've decided to laugh, the kind that surprises you. He couldn't remember the last time that had happened. On the walk back, Wren walked between them, her backpack on, her braid still coming loose on the left side. She was carrying the rest of her ramen in a takeaway container, because she'd ordered too much and wasn't willing to leave it. "Mr. Callard," she said. "Owen," he said. "You can call me Owen." She considered this. "Owen," she said, trying it out. "Do you have kids?" "A daughter, Sadie." "She's 9. Does she like design?" He thought about this honestly, which he hadn't done before. "I don't know," he said. "I haven't asked her." Wren nodded slowly, in the way she had, like she was filing this information somewhere. "You should ask her," she said. "You're right," he said. "I should." She nodded again, satisfied. Then she held out the alphabet she'd been working on. She'd folded it from the notebook, a clean sheet, and handed it to him. He unfolded it. The whole alphabet, careful and considered, each letter finding its own personality without losing coherence. And there at the end, the capital Q, its tail curving under itself in a way that was confident rather than apologetic, that looked like it had always been exactly that way and couldn't have been otherwise. He looked at it for a long moment, standing on the sidewalk in late March with the cold still in the air and the first hint of something warmer somewhere underneath it. "Wren," he said, "this is really good." She didn't preen. She just looked at it with him, considering, the way her mother had looked at her own portfolio pages, with the clear-eyed honesty of someone who knows the difference between being told something is good and it actually being good, and has decided this is the latter. "Yeah," she said, "I think so too." She took the paper back and folded it carefully along the original lines and put it in her pocket, and they walked back to the building, all 3 of them, in the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled.